The execution of Hugh Dispenser the Younger was no ordinary act of medieval justice. It wasn't simply a punishment. It was a meticulously crafted spectacle, designed not just to kill a traitor, but to destroy him entirely. This execution sought to erase every trace of his identity, his memory, and the very whisper of his name. The aim was clear: to show the kingdom what happens to those who dare to take power into their own hands, to unmake a man who had become a shadow monarch. His death was a calculated dismantling of everything he had once been, staged with cruel precision to send a message to anyone who might dare challenge the crown. Hugh Dispenser was not a king by title, but during the reign of Edward II, he wielded a power so absolute that many considered him England's true ruler. His enemies were many, his crimes numerous, alleged treason, corruption, and unspeakable acts. However, the truth was far more disturbing. Hugh Dispenser wasn't executed for breaking the law. He was executed because in his final years, he had become the law. His ambition had no limits, and through it, he manipulated the king and seized control of the crown's power. By the early 1320s, the Kingdom of England was in chaos. The reign of Edward II had crumbled under the weight of his indecisiveness, and Dispenser, along with his male favorites, filled the void with their rule. His dominance over the king wasn't through force, but through subtle manipulation. He didn't need war to rise. He conquered through manipulation. He orchestrated the exile of rivals, seized estates, rewrote inheritances, and even used the royal treasury to fund his own ambitions. He wasn't merely a court advisor. He became the architect of a tyranny, his influence so pervasive that even the parliament became subservient to his will. But power taken so nakedly attracts opposition. And when you take everything without consequence, your enemies grow stronger, and so too does the desire for revenge. At the center of this drama was Queen Isabella, once a loyal wife, but now a woman pushed too far by the growing dominance of Dispenser. The court, once her domain, was overtaken, and she found herself humiliated, politically neutered, and isolated. Dispenser had not only taken control of the king, but had subjected the queen and her household to indignity. But Isabella, though forced into the background, was not without power. In 1325, when sent on a diplomatic mission to France, she did not return with peace in hand. Instead, she returned with an army. Isabella didn't return to England to dethrone her husband at first. She had one goal: to dismantle Dispenser. She aligned herself with Roger Mortimer, a powerful noble, and together they built a rebellion, not of peasants, but of nobles, mercenaries, and foreign allies. They marched through England without resistance. Dispenser's name had become so toxic that even those who once supported him abandoned him, and the kingdom that had once bowed to him now turned its back. The storm that had been gathering was now at its peak. Dispenser was no longer the powerful figure he had been. He was now a fugitive, hunted and humiliated. When he was captured, he was not tried in a court of law. He was paraded before the people, marched through the streets in chains. He was no longer a lord, but a spectacle, a man reduced to nothing. In the town square of Hereford, where Queen Isabella's court had taken root, his final punishment awaited him. He wasn't to be executed in the normal way. No, this execution would be different. It would be a lesson. When Hugh Dispenser the Younger was finally captured in October 1326, he was no longer the man who had once stood beside kings. He was a fugitive, barefoot, filthy, and disguised in the clothes of a commoner. He sought sanctuary in a Welsh abbey, but no place would protect him. He was dragged from the altar steps, humiliated before his enemies, and chained like a criminal. His arrogance and his power were gone, replaced by fear and shame. The man who had once controlled the royal court was now a living monument to failure, his fate sealed in the public eye. The ritual of his humiliation was just the beginning. It was not enough for Dispenser to be executed. His torment had to be seen, felt, and remembered. He was paraded through town after town, each one a step in the psychological crucifixion of a once mighty man. His beard was shaved off, a symbolic emasculation. His royal robes were torn away and replaced with the coarse tunic of a common prisoner. a visual reminder of his fall. He was tied to a horse, facing backward, a final indignity that reduced him to nothing but a spectacle for the masses to witness and jeer at. Chroniclers recorded his suffering in agonizing detail, the iron chains cutting into his skin, his eyes welling with tears, his body trembling in fear. This wasn't justice. This was vengeance, public and cruel. As Dispenser was led to the scaffold in Hereford, the crowd gathered, not to mourn, but to watch his destruction. The platform was raised high, designed for maximum visibility, and soaked with pitch, so that his blood would stand out against the darkened wood. When he was brought before the crowd, weak from fear and exhaustion, Dispenser tried to speak, but his words were drowned out by the sounds of trumpets and drums, an orchestra of public hatred. There was no trial. The sentence had already been written. Treason, sodomy, theft, war crimes. Each accusation was as performative as the last. No evidence was needed. This was not about proving guilt. This was about sending a message, and that message was clear. Power will crush you, humiliate you, and erase you. The executioner did not begin with a swift beheading. No, that would have been mercy. Instead, Dispenser's suffering began with fire. He was hung by the neck, not to die, but to edge him closer to the brink of death. His body twitched in terror, his limbs convulsing, but the executioner released him, allowing him to collapse, barely breathing. Only then did the real punishment begin. First, the castration. The executioner sliced off Dispenser's genitals and held them up like a trophy before tossing them into a fire. The crowd's reaction was mixed. Some cheered, others vomited, but none looked away. They had come for blood, and they would get it. Next came the disembowelment. The executioner slowly sliced open Dispenser's abdomen, drawing out his intestines, inch by agonizing inch. The pain was unbearable, but the executioner was careful not to sever the main arteries too quickly, prolonging the torture. Dispenser screamed. His body twisted in agony, and his eyes locked on Isabella. It was not a plea. It was disbelief. This wasn't justice. It was ritualized revenge, designed to obliterate not just a man, but the very notion of his power. As his intestines were pulled from his body and fed into the flames, the executioner moved on to the heart. The chest was cracked open, the ribs split apart one by one. The heart was removed slowly, agonizingly. By the time it was severed, Dispenser may still have been conscious enough to feel the pain, but not enough to speak. His body was burned, and then came the final step, dismemberment. His limbs were sawed off, each piece of him scattered across England as a visible warning. His head was mounted on a spike at London Bridge. His limbs were sent to York, Bristol, and Northampton, cities that had been key to his rise and fall. Hugh Dispenser the Younger had once controlled everything, but in the end, his body was scattered across the kingdom, a reminder to anyone who would dare reach too far. His legacy was not one of greatness but of annihilation. His name was erased from the records, his title stripped away, and his image purged from royal art. Even in death, his enemies made sure he would be forgotten. The body was not just a corpse, it was a message, one that would echo through the ages. When Hugh Dispenser the Younger was finally captured in October 1326, he was no longer the formidable figure who had once ruled from behind the throne. No longer a shadow monarch, he was a fugitive, hiding in the robes of a monk, his face gaunt and dirty. His attempt to seek sanctuary in a Welsh abbey had failed, and now he was dragged from the altar steps, humiliated and chained like the very criminals he had once sent to their deaths. The king's shadow was no more. The man who had once controlled Edward II's reign was now a shell of his former self, an example of a man who had risen too high, only to fall lower than anyone could have imagined. Dispenser's punishment would not be one of quiet execution in a dark cell. No, the Queen and her allies did not want him to die in silence. They wanted him to suffer, and more than that, they wanted the world to watch. As he was paraded through town after town, the crowds did not gather in sorrow. They came to witness not a death, but a slow and painful destruction. He was no longer a nobleman, but a spectacle. His beard was forcibly shaved from his face, a symbolic emasculation. His royal garments, once luxurious, were torn from him and replaced with a coarse tunic, deliberately chosen to expose his emaciated frame. He had once been an architect of power, but now he was reduced to a puppet, strung up for all to see. The humiliation of Hugh Dispenser had only just begun. He was strapped to a horse, facing backward, his body positioned so that all his dignity was stripped away. The procession was meant to reduce him, not just in the eyes of his enemies, but in his own. Chroniclers of the time tell of how he wept openly, the iron chains biting into his wrists and ankles, his body shaking with fear and exhaustion. This wasn't merely punishment. This was an orchestrated public destruction designed to break him, to strip him of any remaining semblance of power or pride. The people who had once feared him now watched, some in silence, others in jubilation. When Dispenser reached Hereford, the seat of Queen Isabella's court, his fate was sealed. The Queen did not wait in a throne room. She stood outside, among the nobles and the commoners who had suffered under Dispenser's rule. Her face betrayed no joy, no satisfaction, only cold, calculated purpose. There would be no trial. The sentence had already been written, and it was not one of justice. It was a performance. His crimes were read aloud, but no evidence was presented. The charges were purely symbolic: treason, sodomy, theft, and war crimes. They were performative, chosen not for their truth, but for their theatrical impact. This was not about proving guilt. It was about making Dispenser's punishment a spectacle, a warning to anyone who might think they could control the throne without consequence. The scaffold where Dispenser was to meet his end was deliberately built to be high and wide, ensuring that every gruesome detail of his execution would be visible to the crowd. The platform was soaked with pitch, not to reinforce its structure, but to darken it so that the blood of the man who once ruled would stand out in sharp contrast. When Dispenser was brought before the crowd, he was barely conscious from fear and exhaustion. His body trembled, his eyes wide with terror, but he made one last attempt to speak. He begged for mercy, pleaded to confess, to make a final statement. But his words were drowned out by the blaring of trumpets and the beating of drums. The noise was designed not just to announce his execution, but to drown out any chance of remorse or redemption. This was not just an execution, it was an obliteration. His name, his legacy, his very humanity would be erased with every act of cruelty that followed. The executioner did not begin with the swift stroke of a blade. That would have been too merciful. Instead, Dispenser was hanged, but not to kill him. No, the purpose of the hanging was to bring him to the brink of death, to allow his body to hang in the air, choking and twitching, only to be released at the moment when he was on the edge of life and death. As Dispenser's body swayed, his limbs jerking in reflexive terror, the executioner released him. He collapsed, gasping for breath, only to be laid out on the platform, where the real punishment began. The first act of violence was castration. The executioner cut off Dispenser's genitals, holding them aloft like a trophy for the crowd to see before tossing them into the flames. The crowd's reaction was mixed. Some cheered, others vomited, but none looked away. This was no longer a man's death. It was a public spectacle, a brutal reminder of the consequences of absolute power. Next came the disembowelment. Slowly and methodically, the executioner sliced into Dispenser's abdomen, cutting through flesh and muscle until his intestines were exposed. Each inch of the process seemed to prolong his suffering. The executioner ensured that the main arteries weren't severed too quickly, allowing Dispenser to feel the excruciating pain as his internal organs were pulled from his body. The chroniclers recorded that Dispenser screamed, his body writhing uncontrollably. His eyes, filled with terror and disbelief, locked onto Queen Isabella. It was a look of utter horror, not of plea, but of sheer disbelief that this could be his fate. He had once controlled the king, the court, and the kingdom. Now he was reduced to this. As his intestines were pulled from his body, the executioner continued his work, moving on to Dispenser's heart. The chest was cracked open with a hatchet, the ribs snapping one by one as the heart was severed from its arteries. By the time the heart was removed, Dispenser was barely conscious, the pain too intense for him to speak. His heart, like the rest of him, was tossed into the flames to burn before his eyes. Finally, the dismemberment began. His limbs were sawed off, each piece of his body removed and wrapped in linen. His arms, legs, hands, and feet were sent to cities across England as warnings. One went to York, another to Bristol, and a third to Northampton. His head, still bearing the look of agony, was mounted on a spike at London Bridge for all to see. Dispenser's body was no longer a corpse. It had become a symbol, scattered across the kingdom as a reminder of what happens when a man dares to reach beyond the crown and claim power for himself. His remains were never gathered, never given a proper burial. There was no tomb, no memorial. His body was scattered like refuse, a disease that the kingdom sought to burn away. His name was erased from the records, his legacy expunged from history. Yet, despite the efforts to erase him, the horror of what had been done to him could not be hidden. It was etched into the landscape, a grotesque reminder that power, when abused, leads to destruction, not just of the body, but of the soul. In the months that followed, Dispenser's downfall became a cautionary tale. The nobility who had once supported Edward II abandoned him, and the once feared figure of Hugh Dispenser became a ghost in the footnotes of history. His legacy, not of power, but of annihilation, lived on in the whispered stories of the people and in the vivid memory of his gruesome execution. Even in death, Hugh Dispenser remained a powerful symbol. His body had been broken, his name erased, but the message of his destruction would not be forgotten.